Hello there. If you want more excitement in your chess, then you've come to the right place. Few would argue that the snazzy Sicilian dragon is not the most exhilarating opening, and well, those that do are wrong. In 1993 I wrote this stunning masterpiece based partly on my lifetime's experiences. This epic 1995 video of Dances with Wolves proportions depicts some of these thrills and spills in conjunction with the new stuff. I'm here to guide you through the dragon's choppy waters. Hold on to your seats, you're in for the ride of your life. White launches into the open Sicilian with d4, and the Sicilian dragon is initiated by the move g6. Note, the piece most characterising this opening is the both offensive and defensive dragon bishop, which soon materialises on g7. I'm going to split White's options up as follows. First of all, we have the real acid test, the Yugoslav attack, and then the trappy Levenfish. The classical variations follow this, after which we have all of those lines with g3, the lines in which White fianchettos his king's bishop. Finally, we have the trendy 6 bishop c4, in which White intends kingside castling. The Yugoslav attack is without a doubt the most dangerous attempt by White at refuting the Sicilian dragon. Here the bishop moves to e3. Now, this bishop is a very key piece. If White ever wishes to neutralise the dragon bishop, which will materialise on g7, then this piece, the bishop again on e3, is the piece most likely to do so. For this reason, it's always good for Black to keep an eye out on exchanging this bishop off. A move like knight g4 often comes in handy, although here it would be a disaster. White could continue with bishop to b5 check. Now, obviously the knight can't move itself to c6 due to the knight on d4, and if simply bishop d7, then the white queen can capture the g4 knight free of charge. Black continues with the natural bishop to g7, and now pawn to f3. This move characterising the Yugoslav attack. Now, why does White play this move? The first and obvious reason is that it prevents knight to g4. A lot of players actually forget about this. Secondly, White not only supports the e4 pawn, but prepares a pawn storm for later on in the game, perhaps g2 to g4. Hence, Black castles. White continues with the plan of queenside castling, queen to d2, and Black knight to c6. The moves knight c6 and castles can be interchanged. To be honest, there's no real difference. Black has now made all of the usual Sicilian dragon moves and is preparing a central pawn break, d5. This move looks a little unusual, bearing in mind Black did play it to d6 in the first place. However, it seeks to expose White's centrally posted pieces. White, of course, would like to simply advance the pawn to e5, but of course the black knight on c6 puts a stop to that. If White was to exchange on c6 first, and then advance e5, we see that Black has a very strong pawn centre, d5 pawn being supported by the c6 pawn. In particular, Black now has a very useful half-open b-file. The immediate h4 does nothing to affect the central goings-on, and so d5 is an excellent solution. White will only find that in fact he's created a hole on g3. Similarly, bishop to e2, which is slightly irrelevant if white intends castling queenside anyway, can be met very nicely with d5. Thus, white must make a decision. He must do something to intercept this pawn push, and thus has three reasonable choices. Firstly, there is pawn to g4. This intends to meet d5 with g5, when white will win the pawn on d5. Secondly, there is the most natural and obvious castle's queenside. This brings a rook onto the d-line to exert pressure. However, the most popular continuation, and the one that I would like to look at first, is bishop to c4. This is a very dangerous move because it not only controls the square d5, but is very useful along the a2 to g8 diagonal. Probably the least useful of black's minor pieces is this bishop on c8. Here it moves to d7. Now, if white was ever to exchange off on c6, knight takes c6, generally it is advisable for black to recapture with the b pawn anyway. Once again, this allows black to utilise the b line with a rook, but also it controls the very key square d5. The main idea behind the bishop moving to d7 is that it vacates the c8 square. This is useful so that either the f rook or the a rook can zap into action there. Now, there can be several variations on white's play over the next few moves, but the most consistent move order is bishop retreating the b3, something that white will have to do anyway. There are several possibilities for black here, but the move that I am recommending is queen to a5. White castles queenside, and now it is the f rook which sees its way to c8. This is quite important. Firstly, it is possible that the a rook could be used on b8 later on, but even more vital is that now the f8 square has been freed should the black king need to use it as an escape square later on. Now white has four basic ways of continuing. He can go it alone with his h-pawn, h4, intending h5, in order to open up the h-file for his rooks. He can play slightly more cautiously with h4 in conjunction with g4 and then h5. He can play the solid move king to b1. This might be so as to play h4 later anyway, or a slightly more positional move, bishop to g5. Moving swiftly onto white's most direct plan of attack, h4. The black knight moves to e5, preparing to jump into c4, and white carries on immediately with h5. The most pertinent observation here is that white is sacrificing a pawn. Black takes the pawn anyway, knight takes h5. The good news here for black is if white continues with the most direct route, pawn to g4, knight to f6, and then bishop h6, I for one believe that black is already possibly better, certainly he's no worse. let's see what happens. Bishop takes bishop on h6, and if white recaptures the most obvious way, queen takes bishop, it can be seen that white's threatening the obvious knight to d5. This dangerous move would force the removal of black's only left defensive piece, the knight on f6, so that if knight takes d5, simply queen takes h7 check, king f8, and obviously queen h8 checkmate. Do not panic though, because help is on hand with a vital dragon concept. In this position, black responds with the excellent rook takes c3, an exchange sacrifice. After b takes c3, let us pause for a second. Black is still the exchange for a pawn down, but the pawn on c3 is particularly weak, and indeed in an ending the kingside pawns aren't much use either. After black gobbles the pawn on c3, he restores material equality. There's now a dangerous threat of queen to a1 check, king d2, and then queen takes the knight on d4. The most obvious response for white here then is king to b1. Black swings the only piece left to come into the action into the game now with rook c8. White of course could retreat the queen to say d2, but the endgames are very favourable for black. What if white presses on with his attack? g4 to g5. Well, in order to prevent queen takes h7, the black knight would have to spring over to h5. And okay, if desperate times call for desperate measures, white will now sacrifice the exchange. Rook takes h5, g takes h5, and queen takes h5. The simple plan for white now is to bring the rook over to h1, and of course queen takes h7 check. However, black's attacking is not finished, and he will continue knight c4, threatening queen b2 checkmate. The bishop must take this knight on c4, bishop takes c4, and black will recapture with the rook. Now, in this position, the knight on d4 is attacked by the rook, and it really is on pre. If, for example, rook over to h1, and the black queen can capture the knight, and after queen takes h7, king f8, we see the black queen has some excellent defensive qualities. In particular, of course, it's covering g7 and h8. A moral victory has already been earned when the opponent must take extra defensive measures. After the move rook to d3, the only way of saving the knight, black now knows that this rook isn't going to trouble the black king along the h-file. Queen e1 check, king b2, and queen to f2. Here white is in all sorts of trouble. The knight on d4 is again attacked twice by the rook on c4 and the queen on f2, but the knight is unable to move because of the pawn on c2. In fact, the end is very close. If, for example, g6, h takes g6, and queen to d5, looking after the knight, black can play simply bishop e6. Again, if knight takes e6, we see the end. Queen takes pawn on c2. If king a1, queen c1 mate. And if king a3, rook a4 mate. After bishop takes h6, in fact, a better move for white is rook from h1 takes h6. Here, white prepares rook d h1, followed by a very nice idea in rook takes h7, and after knight takes h7, queen to h6. Black is in deep trouble. Earlier I said that most endgames favour black. Here he takes steps to intercept white's plan with the typical dragon sacrifice, once more giving away the exchange on c3. Rook takes knight. Should white recapture with the queen, queen takes c3, black can happily trade off the queens, queen takes c3, b takes c3. In this position, black has one pawn for the exchange, but again those kingside pawns of white's are very weak, and of course the queenside pawn structure is visibly shattered. After rook c8, white must immediately defend the c3 pawn. King d2 was the choice of Donald Holmes in my game against him. The white rooks have no scope to get going, and with the shortly fixed pawn structure, black's knights dominate the board. Black is clearly better, and I went on to win in 47 moves. The rook for knight exchange sacrifice on c3 is a very common feature in the Sicilian dragon, and particularly the Yugoslav attack. A favourite old game of mine was against Philip Morris, now an international master. In this position, he decided to reinforce this knight by retreating his knight from d4 to e2. This knight also has chances to come to f4 and maybe to d5 later on. I played the move bishop to e6, utilising this often redundant piece. The point is that if white trades off on e6, bishop takes e6, and I recaptured f takes e6, although my kingside structure looks a little bit more holy, the particularly useful point is that I'm controlling the d5 square, and I have a free roll of knight to c4. I am actually threatening to play bishop takes b3. If white recaptures with the c pawn, then I can just take the pawn on a2 because of the pin along the c file. If, however, white recaptures with the a2 pawn, his fate is even worse. Queen to a1 check. The knight interposes on b1, something like knight takes f3, g takes f3, and then the bishop on g7 zaps down to b2, checkmate. To guard against these threats, white played king b1. I continued with the usual plan, knight to c4, which after bishop takes c4, rook takes c4, facilitates the doubling of my rooks along the c-file. Not fazed by this, white carried on the king side with g4, but was in line for a big shock. Instead of retreating my knight to the obvious f6 square, I moved on in to g3, the purpose being to deflect the knight from its defensive duties on e2. Indeed, white has little option but to play knight takes g3, and then I played rook takes c3. Now, this is hardly a sacrifice, because if white was to recapture with b takes c3, there would be a mate in 2, starting with taking on a2, queen takes a2 check. Things are looking grim for white now, as black is attacking with 2 bishops, a rook and a queen, and as if it's needed, backup is on its way. White played b3 to prevent queen takes a2 check, and here it comes, rook a c8. Quite an army. Rook takes c2 may well be on the card soon, and so white responded with rook c1. We're not far from the end of the game now, as in came the crushing bishop takes b3. Both a takes b3 and c takes b3 suffer the same fate. Philip's choice was c takes b3, and I continued rook takes b3 check, after which white resigned. Not a moment too soon. After a takes b3, black would play queen a1, checkmate. Earlier, white retreated the knight to e2 in a very Karpovian manner. You can't get away with that sort of play in this line. You won't find this game in any informatas, but it's certainly one of my favourites. Recently, instead of the more endgame weakening g4, and of course the cautious retreat knight d e2, popular has become an old variation, the rather bottling knight d5, opting for a trade of queens. Unfortunately, black can't really avoid this, but I believe after queen takes d2 check, rook takes d2, and king to f8, he has no problems at all. In November 1994, I found myself trying to win this position against an opponent eager for a draw. After g4, knight f6, knight takes f6, and the bishop recapturing on f6, it is clear that white is going to be able to win the h7 pawn. White continued with rook dh2, and black played knight c4. My idea is that after white takes on c4, and I take back with the rook, I'm going to be able to build up a lot of pressure on the c-file. Black simply has to be careful about any tricks that may arise on the h8 square. For example, rook takes h7, and of course already rook h8 checks threatened, but No worries, rook a c8, c3, and for example, the move played b5. Black gains a lot of counterplay on the queen side. We can now see that after h5, although black accelerates white's attack by capturing this pawn, it also cushions the blow for when he sacrifices the exchange on c3. Hence, of course, he has an extra pawn in the endgame. With g4, white intends to continue with plugging on down the h-line, but doesn't intend, at this juncture at least, to give away a pawn. This will give black an extra tempo. How should he use this tempo? Well, a very sensible option is knight into c4. Bearing in mind white will be eager to preserve the dark squared bishop, of course used to neutralise black's dragon bishop, then he will have to play bishop takes c4. This will enable black to double the rooks on the c-line. However, I am suggesting that instead black should continue with b5. Now, as black has moved pawns around his king, a simple pawn race would obviously favour white. He could open up lines against the black king far easier than a pawn storm would open up the white king. However, black has a good reason for playing this move. After h5, instead of b4, which would just force the white knight to the d5 square, he continues with knight c4. The bishop captures this knight for reasons stated before, and now black captures with the b pawn instead of the rook. This will now enable black to build up an attack along the b file. I believe the critical here is bishop h6. As there is no exchange sacrifice going on c3, it appears sensible for black to retreat the bishop to h8. This also means that there's more pieces blocking the h-line. Now, white has a very tricky continuation. The white knight can spring to f5. As I speak to you now, I still do not know the truth about this position. If g takes f5, not a very good idea. Queen g5 check is simply crushing. The threat at the moment is knight takes e7 mate. And after rook e8, black can continue with a plan of attacking along the b file. One observation is that the knight no longer being on d4 opens up the diagonal from h8 to a1, so possibly there will be a sacrifice later on the b2 square. However, after rook e8, the question is, does h takes g6, f takes g6 and bishop g7 pose black insurmountable problems? Now this looks like an absolutely wild move, but if you look at it in more detail, you'll find that there's quite a few problems. I still don't know though whether or not it is really bad news for black. Have no fear, even if that line is good for white, black has another option in bishop takes f5. This opens up the G file for white after G takes f5, but with rook A b8 there is going to be a very interesting battle. Whose attack will break through first? The h8 bishop may look out of the game, but with the possible pressure on b2 from both this bishop and the rook and queen, I believe that black has excellent chances. Certainly an exciting game will be in prospect. The following game continued along similar paths. White was Martin Ollison, an experienced dragon player himself, and black was new recruit, international master Jonathan Tisdall. Here Martin opted for h takes g6. Black recaptured with the f-pawn, and at this point I would like to say a few words about which way black should recapture. Of course, normally we know the rule recapture towards the centre. If you're going to get checkmated down the h-file, this rule isn't really applicable. So John correctly recaptured with the f-pawn, after which white played the rather unsubtle rook d to g1. It's fairly clear that white is lining up knight to f5. Well, the natural rook a b8 was played, black himself getting on with pressure on the b2 pawn, a very important target, and white surprisingly played bishop h6. I say surprisingly because one would have thought that maybe knight f5 immediately was more to the point. Anyway, bishop h6, black avoided the exchange with bishop h8, and only then did white wade in with knight f5. There's a clear danger here though, in that this diagonal from h8 to a1 is becoming more unblocked. Also, it's clear that now this sacrifice isn't really sound. This was proved with g takes f5. If white was simply to recapture this f5 pawn with the pawn, the black king would be safe on f7. So instead, white pushed on with g5, but was hit with a double sacrifice. Knight captures on e4. The pawn had to take this intrusive knight, pawn takes knight, and then a stunning blow. Rook takes b2. This move has been on the cards for quite a while. If the king were to capture on b2, then either rook b8 check, or indeed queen b4 check, would both be followed by the capture of the knight on c3 and an imminent checkmate. So white plugged on g6, desperately flailing around the black king, but after queen takes c3, g takes h7 check, king f7, the black king was perfectly safe and white was only 5 moves away from the end of the game. Powerful and effective. No doubt in future Martin Ollison will be sticking to the black side. With the move king b1, white isn't putting all of his eggs into one basket, Black continues knight e5, as usual eyeing up the c4 square. Here it is important to note exactly why it is that it was the f rook which moved to c8 and not the a8 rook. If I was to switch them around, we now would notice that white could play knight to d5. If then queen takes d2, white can interpose knight takes e7 check, king h8, and then recapture the queen. With the f8 rook having moved to c8, we notice that black has available the f8 square for the king. This means that this combination no longer works. So now, if knight d5, queen takes d2, knight takes e7 check, king f8 means that after the rook recaptures the queen, of course, black will win the knight on e7. With h4, we now see white's willingness to continue the attack. How should black play? Well, knight to c4, facilitating the doubling of rooks, is a useful plan, but also is the interesting b5. As previously seen, the idea here is not so much to advance the pawn to b4, which would force the white knight to where it wants to go to on d5, but rather to follow up with knight c4 when black can recapture with the b pawn. Let's see an example of this. Well, if white plods on with bishop h6, then black can ignore this with knight c4. The white bishop recaptures the knight, and black opens up the b line. B takes c4. From here, black can continue with obvious moves like rook a b8 and queen to b4. There aren't many ways for white to protect the checkmate on b2. If the pawn were to advance to b3, of course, the white knight on c3 is going to be extremely vulnerable. And if the queen retreats to c1, of course the knight on c3 is effectively en prise. In fact, correct play after knight c4, bishop takes knight, is first to remove the bishop on h6. The intention is to draw the queen away from its defensive duties. Now here it's possible for white to fall into a trap. He may see a free pawn coming his way with bishop takes f7 check, this bishop of course being doomed on c4 anyhow. The point is that after king takes f7, white can simply take on h6. When another useful point for white is that the b file is no longer open. However, black can foil these plans with king g7, and it is he who has the last laugh. The white queen must move away, and then black can capture the bishop on f7, leaving him a piece to the good. I believe the real test of this variation comes with knight c takes b5. Indeed, this demonstrates that black is in fact sacrificing a pawn. You may well ask, why wasn't that possible before? Let's return. Knight back on c3, pawn on b5. Let's put the king back on c1 and play g4. Of course, now after knight c takes b5, it can be seen that the f3 pawn is particularly vulnerable. For example, queen takes d2 check, rook takes d2, bishop takes b5, knight takes b5, and knight takes f3. Particularly weak now are both the e4 pawn and the g4 pawn. So, after knight takes b5, as the pawn on g2 is protecting f3, we've got to ask ourselves, is black going to obtain enough compensation for the pawn? Well, our friend Martin Ollison has demonstrated that it's possible to even exchange queens and generate enough play. Indeed, he's not the first person to do so. Let's see. Queen takes d2. The bishop takes back on d2. And rook a b8. We're now following a game in which he played against Richard Britton. White supported the knight on b5 with a4. The knight was forced away, a6. And the knight retreated to a3. Now this looks like a funny place to put the knight, but the idea is that he's trying to control the key c4 square. Now black engaged in an excellent manoeuvre. The bishop retreated to e8. The point behind this soon becomes clear. White retreated the knight to e2, obviously worried that it might become a little bit vulnerable there. And knight fd7. The point is that black is sending backup. This knight is manoeuvring itself around to the c4 square. White makes plans to intercept this journey, bishop to e3 and knight b6 anyway. White saw fit to remove the knight before it got to c4, bishop takes knight, and rook took back on b6. The dark square bishop, as I've mentioned previously, is an excellent prize because now there is nothing in white's position to neutralise the dragon bishop. Already it can be seen that there is going to be pressure mounting on the b2 square, and the knight on a3 is clearly very much out of the game. Another obvious target is the pawn on a4. At the moment only defended by the bishop on b3, which is the flimsy cover for the rooks along the b line. White added a bit more protection with knight to c3. And black played another good move, h5. Of course, black is in no danger from any kingside attack, but this move serves the purpose of fixing the white pawn on h4. This pawn could easily be attacked later on, and it's not great for white to have to keep a rook on h1 to simply defend the pawn. Well, white centralised his rook with rook he1, and the black king moved to f8. The only good thing about white's position is that the white knight on c3 has still got the d5 square to go to. The idea behind king f8 was simply to defend the occasionally vulnerable e7 pawn. The white knight indeed hopped into d5, a useful square, but at the same time still opening up the h8 to a1 diagonal. In particular, of course, this bishop on g7 about to attack the pawn there on b2. Well, the rook retreated out of danger, rook b7. And now white, obviously a little worried about this a4 pawn, advanced it to a5. Also with the intention perhaps of moving the knight from d5 into b6. However, black demonstrated that the pawn on a5 was not even safe there. Rook up to c5 to attack it. This pawn is now doomed. White really struggled now, retreated the knight to e3. Black took the pawn, rook takes a5. And the white rook came to d5. Clearly white seems to want to swap off his comparatively redundant rooks for the black ones, which are looking quite aggressive. Black traded off, rook takes d5, and now white made a very risky reply. Bishop takes d5, and now was in for a real shock. Bam! Rook takes b2 check. The king is virtually forced to recapture. King takes rook, and then knight d3 discovered check. The check, of course, from the knight and the bishop, a double check. King dropped back to b1, but after knight takes rook on e1, the endgame was easily winning for black. He's a pawn up and has got the power of the two bishops on a fairly open board. There, white was made to suffer in the endgame after the trade of queens on d2. However, for the more adventurous of you, what about keeping the queens on? Queen back to d8. This looks like a very funny move, because after all, what does the queen do here other than defend e7? Well, the point is that the queen will be back into the action later on. Take a gander at this crazy game of mine against I.M. Brink Clausen. Here, he tried to trade off the bishops, bishop to h6, removing some of the very long-term pressure on b2. I believe it's one possibility here to actually exchange on h6. And after queen takes h6, rook a b8, knight retreats to c3, black can play rook takes c3, a familiar exchange sacrifice, but rarely done when you're actually a pawn down already. B takes c3, and then a5. This is fairly unclear. Black, of course, is threatening a4. However, to maintain more complexity in the position, I retreated the bishop to h8. White preempted rook a b8 with knight c3, and I played rook a b8 anyhow. Now white, feeling in the mood for a challenge, launched with g4, preparing the usual attack along the h-file. Well, I played likewise a5, preparing to attack the bishop on b3, and white blockaded that with a4. Now, ever since the white bishop went to h6, it's neglected its defensive duties in the centre of the board. I hope to exploit this with rook to b4. One possibility is the sacrifice of the exchange at some stage on d4. White continued with h5, and now a very funny looking move. I blocked this quite dangerous diagonal from a2 to g8 with rook c to c4, offering, of course, the exchange. If white were to take this rook now with bishop takes c4, my knight would find its way to this excellent square, knight takes c4, and both the queen on d2 and the pawn on b2 would be in trouble. In fact, white set a fiendish trap with h takes g6. If here I was to greedily snatch the knight on d4, I would fall foul of g takes f7 check, the knight must recapture, and then queen to g5, terminating the game swiftly. So I recaptured on g6 with my h-pawn. It wasn't really an option to do so with the f-pawn because of the pin exerted by the b3 bishop. White now supported the knight in the centre with bishop back to e3, now threatening to sacrifice the exchange, rook from h1, removing my vital defensive and attacking dragon bishop. So I avoided this possibility with bishop to g7, and white came in with an attacking plan of his own. Knight f5, not to be outdone in the sacrifice stakes. Well, I thought, why not? G takes f5, and white recaptured with the g-pawn, thus opening up the g-file towards my king. Well, I saw a pawn, knight takes f3, clearing more this diagonal towards the white king, although I'm aware of the fact that my bishop may well soon find itself pinned to my king. White dodged the queen over to g2, and I opened up the diagonal with knight takes e4, leaving the knight on f3 to be taken. White took this knight on e4. Of course, there's a danger at the moment of knight takes c3, so the knight took on e4, and I left my rook and my knight still attacked with bishop takes f5. So now I've got two very nice bishops pointing towards the white king. Well, white left the knight on e4 and instead played bishop to h6, threatening, of course, queen down to g7 mate. I defended the bishop with queen to f8, At this point I was feeling very confident, but now came a rather nasty blow. Rook takes d6. The problem is that if I take this rook on d6 with my pawn, e takes d6, then comes knight f6 check, king h8, and bishop takes g7, double check, and of course checkmate. I hadn't actually seen this move, but I certainly observed now that white was threatening rook to d8, deflecting my queen from its task of defending the bishop on g7. I was obviously quite worried here, but I found a nice resource, although still I'm not sure if it really should save me the game. I played rook takes c2. An incredible looking move. Well, how can white take this rook? If white takes it with the queen, then the bishop can take the knight, pinning the queen to the king. Similarly, if white takes the rook with the king, I can simply take the knight with the bishop. Well, probably white should recapture on c2 with the bishop, but of course this would allow the pawn on b2 to be taken by the rook. Instead, white thought he'd seen a win with queen takes g7 check. I was forced to recapture, queen takes g7, and white played rook d8 check. Well, of course it's no use putting the queen in the way, so king h7 was forced, and white now had bishop takes g7, discovered check. The point is clear. If I was simply to recapture this bishop on g7 now, white could then take my rook with the bishop, and I would be a whole rook down. However, I had seen this defensive resource and instead replied rook h2 to get out of the check. Now, of course, the knight on e4 is pinned to the king, and white also has a bishop on b3 and a bishop on g7 on pre. So it looks at this point as though I'm going to get my piece back. Black took on h2, rook takes h2. I took on h2, not particularly leaving my knight in a great position. And the white bishop came back to c3. White still has two dangerous bishops, and if it came down to a race between these two pawns on a4 and b2, and the pawns on f7 and e7, if white had two bishops against a bishop and a knight, definitely white would have the better chances. I captured the bishop on b3. Of course, the knight on e4 is still pinned, but white escaped the pin with king a2. I retreated my rook to b7, and now what follows is a bit of an anticlimax. The rook went to h8 check, my king went to g6. Of course, if white takes the knight on h2, I'll take the knight on e4. So instead, white played rook g8 check, king h7, and rook h8 check, whereby we shook hands and agreed a draw. That really was quite a hairy game, and to be honest, I couldn't actually say that I was winning at any point. Plenty of exciting stuff. Perhaps here, though, I could suggest rook takes d4, and after queen takes d4, knight takes f3, I will certainly win the pawn on g4 with my bishop on the next move, and then I'll have some quite handy kingside pawns. Of course, I'll still be the exchange down. With bishop g5, white takes a totally positional stance. One idea is perhaps at some point to take on f6, but to regain the dark squared bishop with knight in to d5. We'll come to a variation of this type in a second. A solid response is rook up to c5. This both protects the queen on a5 and potentially attacks the bishop on g5. If white forced the removal of the knight from e5 with f4, the knight could come into c4 anyway. Bishop taking on c4, rook takes c4. Now, of course, the black rook then has had to move to c5 and then to c4. However, the point is that the e4 pawn is very weak. An excellent example is if knight b3 attacking the queen on a5, black has the stupendous queen takes c3. A queen sacrifice on c3 instead of an exchange sacrifice. B takes c3 and knight takes on e4. Now we see white has all sorts of trouble on c3. Of course, the queen's attacked on d2 at the moment, but black is threatening to take this pawn on c3 with the knight. For example, queen d3, knight takes c3, check. Black is attacking with the knight, the rook, and the dragon bishop. But as if that's not enough, the a8 rook can come to c8, and the often redundant bishop on d7 can come to f5 at some point. Black certainly has enough compensation and indeed is winning. One observation here is that if white plays the rather dull bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and knight to d5, after queen takes on d2, white can get in knight takes f6 check before recapturing on d2. Clearly, if black were to take on f6 with the pawn, his pawn structure would be horrible in the resulting endgame. However, he can play the clever idea king g7, so that then if white plays rook takes d2, the king can take on f6. Amusing is that if white sets the suicidal knight on another errand with knight h5 check, instead of taking it with the pawn, black can in fact try king h6, intending to recapture on h5 with the king. The king, of course, is a vital piece in the endgame. Instead, white could prepare the f4 push with rook h e1. Then we see a familiar plan, b5, so that on f4 the knight can come to c4. If bishop takes knight, then b takes c4, opening up the b file. I'd like to demonstrate to you another of my games, this time against Stefan Sievers, who in fact is a dragon player himself. Having no kingside attack, he pushed forward in the centre with e5. But I ignored the attack on my knight. I don't feel that there's anything wrong with simply d takes e5, but instead I was happy with the move rook a b8, preparing of course queen to b4. He took on f6, e takes f6, and I took back with the pawn. It should be noted here that although the f6 pawn obstructs the g7 bishop, it will be able to move on. White retreated the bishop to h4, and I continued with queen b4, queen to b4, threatening mate on b2. Of course, if white plays b3, as we've seen before, I can simply use my c-pawn to take on b3, and then the knight on c3 will be hanging. Instead, white played queen c1. Here, he felt he was setting a trap, which it appeared that I'd fallen for. Queen takes knight on c3. The point was knight b3. My rook is attacked on c5, and of course, as the knight unpins the king on the b line, white is threatening pawn takes queen. However, I had noticed this and played anyway, c takes b3. Well, in for a penny, in for a pound. White had to take the queen, b takes c3, and I played b takes a2 check. White has just two choices here. The king could move to a1. Then I intended to open up my bishop with f5, and white's in all sorts of trouble. The most obvious threat is bishop takes c3 check, king takes a2, rook a5 check, and after queen a3, mating is rook b2 check, king a1, rook takes queen. A dainty little finish. So instead, white took the pawn on a2, king takes a2, and chose to return the queen after rook a5 check, queen a3. Of course, if white gets the rook for the queen, that will still leave him the exchange up. However, next came bishop e6 check. The point being, of course, both c4 and king a1 are no use to white, because then he'll be losing his queen for absolutely nothing. White's forced to play rook takes e6, and then I took the queen. Rook takes a3 check, king takes a3, and after f takes e6, black is clearly better, in fact winning in the endgame. A nice touch is that I've ironed out my kingside pawns. I now have no isolated pawn on d6. You may think that it's lucky, but honest, I'd planned that now white couldn't take on d6 because of bishop f8 pinning the rook to the king. The 9g4 variation of the Yugoslav attack was suggested by John Nunn in his book Beating the Sicilian as a good weapon against the Sicilian dragon. However, since Beating the Sicilian 2, he's clearly gone off this idea. We've seen how g4 prevents the break d5 because of g5. I'm suggesting that instead black makes advantage of the fact that white hasn't planted the bishop on c4 by putting his own bishop on e6. It's clear here that the white knight could take on e6, it could take the bishop. Then after f takes e6, some might say, well, black has double pawns here, the e6 pawn particularly is vulnerable, and the black king position is a bit more holy. In fact, the truth is that the pawn on e6 controls the key d5 square, preventing the white knight from going there, and in particular, weak is this f3 pawn. g4 has been highlighted as a weakness because now the knight can go to e5, making it particularly vulnerable in conjunction with the rook on f8. Instead, white will castle queenside, possibly with the idea of the usual h4 to h5 plan. And now, a very reasonable move is for black to trade off on d4. Knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and spring the queen into action on a5. However, I would like to demonstrate an alternative plan starting with knight e5. One thing you will notice is that if the bishop on f1 hasn't moved to c4 and then back to b3, then when it captures a piece on c4, it will effectively have gained 2 tempo. However, black's intention is to ultimately obtain the knight on c4 by first trading off bishops with bishop to c4. This means that when white captures on c4 and black takes back, he'll be forking both the queen on d2 and a particular prize. Well, of course the queen's a prize, but the prize bishop on e3, the main neutraliser of the dragon bishop. In January 1995, the German Fabian Kroger attempted a mass liquidation with g5. Now comes a fairly forced sequence of moves. Knight h5, f4, the knight comes to c4, not the original plan, but of course we now have the weakening of the e4 pawn. White played knight takes bishop on e6. I must take the queen on d2, knight takes d2. His knight took my queen on d8, and I took the bishop on f1. White took the knight, rook h takes f1, and so as to mix and match things a little bit, I conceded my dragon bishop in order to wreck white's queenside structure. Bishop takes c3. White chose to save the knight, knight takes b7. I utilised a pin with bishop takes b2 check, king takes b2, and then rook fb8, of course guaranteeing the win of the knight. Well, in order to prepare for the impending check, white played rook to d3, rook takes b7 check, and then rook b3. Of course, I'm not interested in trading off these rooks. Rook went instead to c7. White centralised the bishop to d4, bishop d4. And I zap my rook up to c4, hoping to exploit the weakness of these pawns on e4 and f4. White played c3. Now, a little word about this knight here on h5. Of course, knights on the rim are often dim. g5 is generally not a move that white wants to play because it only seeks to block up the h-file. Of course, here the knight looks a little bit out of play, but it can often come back to the f4 square. In particular, I played now knight takes f4. The rook had to take, and after e5 I entered a very favourable rook and pawn endgame which I managed to convert. A dragon miniature, which I'm not ashamed to say I've had several times, continued with h4. Instead of bishop to c4, I played queen over to a5, setting actually a devious trap. In an international game at Gausdal in 1987, my opponent Foxy played king b1, a particularly natural move. In fact, as you'll see, a3 would be better, but after rook a c8, or indeed rook f c8, black can easily generate some counterplay along the b and c files. After king b1, it's incredible to believe that white is basically already lost. Black hits white with a double blow, a double whammy, starting with knight takes f3. One knight gives itself up. Now here you're going to notice how the dragon bishop diagonal is slowly uncovered. So, one pair of knights after knight takes f3 is removed from the diagonal. The knight on c3 is fulfilling a very useful role. It's protecting the pawn on a2. And now that is unwrapped from the diagonal. Knight takes e4, a second knight sacrifice. Of course, this one cannot be accepted. If knight takes e4, queen takes a2 check, king c1, and of course either queen a1 or queen takes b2, both checkmate. Seeing the worst, white played queen d3. But now his king's defences are completely removed. Knight takes c3 check, b takes c3, and here, instead of allowing the white king to escape to c1 and d2, I simply played bishop takes c3. Here white called it a day. Black has several threats, including queen b4 check and what will be down to b2 mate. If, for example, queen b5, there's several ways to win after queen takes a2 check, king c1, for example, queen a3 check, king b1, and queen a1 mate. Some textbooks have suggested that white can preempt black's plan of queen a5 with king b1. However, I've been able to use home analysis, which in fact demonstrates that after queen a5, the move knight d5, often successful, here is not very good at all. Queen takes queen on d2. Of course, the knight takes e7 check, king to h8, and the rook recaptures the queen. At the moment white feels, well, look, I'm a pawn up and this d6 pawn here is weak. But things are not as rosy as they seem. After rook a e8, we're already beginning to see that the knight on e7 is in a bit of trouble. White played g5, the knight went to h5. As previously mentioned, it will come back into the game at some point. The knight retreats to its only squared d5, but after bishop takes d5, e takes d5, black has knight takes f3. The point being that after knight takes f3, black can take the bishop on e3, rook takes e3. I won this particular game and it's not surprising. What you'll notice is that not only is the g5 pawn particularly weak later on, but the dark squared bishop is mysteriously much more dominant than white's equivalent light squared bishop. So, am I saying that in fact the 9g4 variation is hopeless and a forced win for black? Well, hardly. I certainly don't think it's any threat, and it would appear that after knight e5 in this particular position, a plan of h4 and h5 isn't really applicable anymore. Perhaps white should try to play for f4. This will of course mean rearranging his whole kingside structure, perhaps starting off with the move h3. Hardly a move to set us quaking in our boots. In this position, after their usual Yugoslav attack moves, 9 castles must be the most logical continuation. The rook now on d1 exerts further pressure on d5 in order to persuade black not to play the usual break. However, in my view, black is best not put off. You could well claim perhaps the bishop should find its way to e6, like in the 9g4 variations, but now the f3 pawn is not very weak, so I would suggest that white could in fact capture this bishop with the knight on e6. Let's take a look at d5. The most pertinent observation here should be that in fact black is sacrificing a pawn. Very rarely played, in fact, is e takes d5, black recapturing with the knight, knight takes d5, knight takes c6, b takes c6. Of course, black's queenside pawn structure here is a little bit shot to pieces, but of course this is not where his king is, and there is a nice b file in order to attack the white king. So the pawn greedy move would be knight takes d5, c takes d5, and then queen takes the pawn on d5. At first sight it would appear that white is going to swap off the queens and simply be a pawn up in an endgame. Not so. The queen moves to c7. Here you'll notice how there's the b file and the c file for which to attack the white king, as well of course as the usual diagonal here, bishop g7. So what happens after queen takes rook? Well, then comes bishop f5, threatening both queen takes c2 checkmate and rook takes queen. Well, white can get a second rook for the queen. Queen takes rook on f8. King recaptures. Now, a few words about this position. White has got 2 rooks and a pawn for the queen. However, the rook on h1 is of course not much use at the moment, and the 2 bishops and the queen are superb attacking instruments. Theory considers this to be very nice for black. In fact, the old popular continuation was after e takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes c6, b takes c6. Instead of going after the pawn, white would offer a trade of bishops with bishop to d4, trying to remove the dangerous threat of the dragon bishop on white's king. Black would temporarily block in the bishop with e5. Of course, this pawn could always advance to e4 later on. Bishop c5. And now, black would sacrifice the exchange with bishop to e6. I say sacrifice the exchange. Very rarely would this bishop actually capture the rook on f8. Why? Because then the two black bishops and the rook, as well of course as the queen, would conduct a very strong attack on the white king. Am I therefore saying that the bishop is more valuable than the rook? Well, in fact, in some positions, yes, because as I keep saying, something needs to prevent this bishop from dominating the game, and this piece, the bishop on c5, is the main candidate. Instead, white will play knight to e4, but after rook e8, or in fact still leaving the rook there, rook to b8, black has very good play. It's clear that white's not getting anything out of these lines because these have completely gone out of fashion. When I wrote my book in 1992 and 1993, the move Queen e1 was already beginning to surface. Back then, I predicted that this may well be the future of the variation and that we would see a lot more of it. In fact, this prediction has proved to be correct. Most of the 9 castles Yugoslav attack games involve this variation. The point is, the rook on d1 is now unleashed for potential pressure against the queen on d8. So, for example, d takes e4 is not possible now because of knight takes c6. Another of my recent games, this one played in the Copenhagen Open in 1994, illustrates black's chances in this line. Here I opted to support my d5 pawn with e6. I'm not the first person to have chosen this line. The most to the point continuation for white is to start rolling his kingside pawns in a threatening manner. h4 must be, I believe at least, the best move for white. After g4, the pawn on f3 again is weakened, and I think black has an excellent response in e6 to e5, changing tact but hoping to exploit these white pawns. For example, knight takes c6, b takes c6, e takes d5, c takes d5, bishop to g5. Now here it appears that white's attacking both the e5 pawn and the d5 pawn based on the fact that the knight's pinned to the queen. In fact, now black can play bishop to b7, and we can see the point. The g4 pawn would much rather be back on g2 from where it could protect the f3 pawn. Here, if white captures the rather hot pawn on e5, he could well face a punishment along the a1 h8 diagonal. For example, h6, if bishop back to h4, g5, bishop e1, and knight takes g4. After h4, queen c7, h5, I believe that black can spurn this pawn on h5 in a very satisfactory manner with d takes e4, intending h takes g6, f takes g6 in view of the fact that the h file becoming open at this point wouldn't be so nice for black, f takes e4, and then knight g4, eyeing up the dark squared bishop. I feel with the e5 square vacant for either a knight or a queen, black has no problems. In the recent 1994 Copenhagen Open, the Danish international master Erling Mortensen tried to utilise the uncovering of the d1 rook with the move knight b3, a fairly logical move. Now here I vacated the d-line with queen c7, also putting my queen on the same line as the white king. This is also a pawn sacrifice if white feels he can accept it. Here he exchanged on d5, ed, I let loose my dragon bishop, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, and e takes d5. White didn't actually take this pawn on d5. Had he done so with rook takes pawn, the problem is the pressure that would have mounted on c2. Black could have continued with bishop to e6 or even bishop f5, and then we see how the bishop, the queen, and of course possibly a black rook coming to c8 would have caused the white king a lot of danger with moves like knight to b4 in the air. Instead, white opted for bishop c5, hitting the rook, and after rook d8 could actually have captured this pawn on d5 because of the trick on e8. For example, if rook takes d5, rook takes d5, queen to e8 check will be pretty terminal. The point is that of course I don't have to take the rook on d5, and in the same vein as before I can gain counterplay on the c2 pawn with either bishop e6 or bishop to f5. I must say that white was definitely struggling for a plan. Here he played bishop to b5, and I continued my development with bishop f5. Dangerous threat looming on c2. Here white conceded his bishop for my knight on c6. I could of course recapture with the b pawn, and then my d5 pawn will be nice and solid in the centre, but I wanted to leave the c file free for my major pieces, so queen takes c6, and now rook d2, white bolsters the c2 square. Here I recognised that the knight on b3 was quite short of squares, as well as the fact that it has to protect the bishop on c5, so immediately I launched into a5, threatening to go on to a4. White of course can't play a4 himself here because the pawn would just be vulnerable to the black queen. White retreated the bishop to d4, hoping of course for a simple trade when the white knight would be superb in the centre of the board. However, I continued with a4, and now we see quite a lot of embarrassment for this white knight on b3. In fact, the only available square was a1, knight a1. Never good at the best of times. In fact, now white is losing by force. I continued queen to c4, threatening both the bishop on d4 and the pawn on a2. If now white was to take on g7, bishop takes g7, I would have queen takes a2, threatening queen takes knight mate. Then if b3, guarding the knight with the bishop on g7, I could simply take this bishop with my king, but even stronger would be d4, and it's complete curtains for white. Instead, white tried his hand with b3, but after a takes b3, a takes b3, fell foul of bishop takes d4, effectively winning a piece. If pawn takes queen, rook takes a1, checkmate. Because of this, white resigned. In the 9 castles Yugoslav attack variation, queen e1 is all the rage, but the ball is now firmly in white's court. If he is to hassle black, he must come up with something more effective. Second to the Yugoslav attack, the 11 fish variation is the most dangerous against the Sicilian dragon. Only though because it sets a wicked trap. If black was to continue with the most natural looking move, bishop to g7, then white has e5. The unprepared opponent would now try d takes e5, f takes e5, and then would wonder where to move this knight. It's clear that knight to d7 would allow e6, with all sorts of problems. What's wrong with knight g4? I asked myself this same question years ago when I fell hook, line and sinker for the trap. Bishop to b5 check. Well, obviously the black knight can't go to c6 because of white's knight on d4. I can't move the knight to d7 because the g4 knight would then be on pre, and if king f8, then knight e6 check, and the black queen's lost. I continued happily at the time, I was only 10, with bishop d7, but disaster, queen takes g4, and black's a piece down. f4 may seem a little premature, and black can, instead of playing bishop g7, test white in the centre with knight to c6. However, to avoid any complications, I'm going to suggest the move knight b d7. You may well say that this blocks in the bishop on c8, but black has a simple plan to follow. The bishop can come to g7, as well as castling, and the bishop can enter the game with moves like a6 and b5, with bishop to b7 to follow. In between, the black queen can move to c7 to cover any temporary holes on c6, as well as preventing any e5 pushes white might plan. Now, it's clear that there's a lot of pressure on e4, from the knight on f6, the bishop on b7, a potential pawn to b4, forcing away the knight on c3. Also, the black knight could come to c5 to hit it. On top of this, there's the usual dragon plan of knight b6 to c4. Of course, this all looks very impressive when black has so many moves in a row, but it's not bad even when white has his full quota. Joining the action on move 10 in the game Klunt versus Julian Hodgson, white played f5. His idea is a pawn storm with g4 and g5. Black capitalised on the square conceded on e5, knight into e5, and white prevented this b7 to b5 push with a4. Black settled for second best, b6. The b pawn will not be able to exert pressure on the c3 knight, but certainly the bishop can come to b7. White played queen e1, preparing to bring the queen over to h4. Black continued, bishop b7, and the white queen indeed came out. Quite an attacking post. Black developed this rook to c8, and white played rook a d1. Here, both sides have developed most of their pieces, but after black's next move, the stunning rook takes c3, his position falls apart at the seams. After b takes c3, black actually played queen c7, and we see now the white pawn on c3 and the white pawn on e4 are particularly vulnerable. Black is already clearly better, and in fact won in just 27 moves. With sensible play, these variations are proven to be quite unproblematic for black. Ask any Najdorf player who is able to reach these lines by transposition. The classical variation is characterised by the move bishop e2. From here, the bishop controls the g4 square, and white simply prepares castling kingside. To add to some confusion, the classical dragon is also of interest to those players that play the classical Sicilian. If I replace g6 with knight c6, many black players here opt to adopt a Sicilian dragon setup by playing g6 anyway. A comparison can be made with the Levenfish variation, in which black Najdorf players can easily transpose into a dragon. In the old variation of the classical, after bishop g7, white would continue bishop e3, we'd have castles, and knight to c6. Black's moves knight c6 and castles are interchangeable. Now here, the point is that black is threatening this move d5, as we saw in the Yugoslav attack. This then is the solution to any casual move such as king h1 or h3. Both fairly reasonable looking moves. Amazingly, even in 1995, in fact my most recent classical dragon game before making this video, I had f3 played against me. Now, I'm not quite sure what the reason behind that move is, but d5, as I've preached before, was my solution. Here, white traded on d5, ed. I recaptured with my knight, knight takes d5. With the bishop on e3 a target, white felt the need to exchange on d5 again, this time with the knight, knight takes d5, and I recaptured with my queen. As I've mentioned before, it's white's centrally posted pieces which can easily become the targets. Well, we had another trade, knight takes c6, and although queen recapturing on c6 looks like the most obvious move, in fact I chose b takes c6. The reason being that in view of the threat queen to e5, hitting both e3 and b2, white had to swap off. Queen takes d5, and my isolated pawn was now de-isolated. C takes d5. Black's clearly on top already here. His centre pawns are much more effective than the rather immobile white queenside pawns here. It seems then that white must take steps to prevent this d5 break. The logic is that all of the preventative measures he can take concede something. Let's take a look. First of all, white has queen up to d2. Although this doesn't actually prevent d5, it does allow a white rook to come and put a bit more pressure. However, the problem with this is white no longer guards the g4 square with two pieces, meaning that black can now play knight to g4. White cannot afford to lose this dark square bishop, and he can't move it because of the knight on d4. So this means he must part with one of his two bishops. Bishop takes g4, and black can recapture. Bishop takes g4. This means that black has the advantage of the two bishops. He must be careful though. After f4, white's threatening f5 and then trapping the light square bishop with h3. After f4 though, black has a simple solution in knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and then e5. The bishop will retreat to e3, and after e takes f4, the light square bishop is in no danger. Rook takes f4, the bishop retreats to e6, and in an open board, black is probably slightly better. See how the two bishops zap towards the queen side. With f4, white intends to meet d5 with e5. Then he would have a solid centre pawn structure, and the d5 pawn would be more vulnerable than if white had been forced to trade off the knight on c6. However, the problem with f4 is that it now opens up the g1 to a7 diagonal, and black can exploit this immediately with queen b6. Placing the black queen on the same diagonal as the dark square bishop here could easily be risky business, but after say knight f5, black has queen takes b2. White wins the dark squared bishop, the dragon bishop, knight takes g7, but after queen takes c3, it's clear that he's losing a piece, either the bishop on e3 or the knight on g7, leaving black with a winning position. The point behind queen b6 is that if, say, queen d2, preparing nasty discovered knight moves, and making the b2 pawn a bit of a poison pawn, I'm sure that the black queen would get trapped down there. But if queen d2, black has simply knight takes e4, not a sacrifice, because after knight takes e4, the bishop will just capture on d4, and exchanges will leave black simply a pawn to the good. Indeed, other discovered knight moves are threatened as well, such as knight g4. In fact, the only justification for this is e5, the so-called Zollner gambit. However, after accurate play by black, starting with de, fe, knight takes e5, knight f5, queen takes b2, knight takes e7 check, king h8, and bishop d4, the move queen b4 exposes this as a bag of tricks. The main move then in this position is knight b3, preventing the break d5, but enabling black's light square bishop to go to a more active post on e6. White will expand on the king side now with f4, preparing perhaps to squash this bishop back with f5. For this reason, it used to be considered that black should play knight a5 enabling the bishop after f5 to go to c4. However, after, say, rook c8, it can be seen that f5, bishop d7 creates a more important concession in the square on e5. For example, g4 preferring to really squash black with g5 and maybe even f6 later on. Nevertheless, black has an excellent, and now what should be familiar, resource in knight e5, g5, and here it comes, rook takes c3. If the pawn were to capture the knight on f6, black could escape with his rook by taking on e3. Therefore, b takes c3, but now white's centre crumbles, knight takes e4, and black has excellent compensation for the exchange. Note the weaknesses: c3, c2, f5 and g5, as well as an exposed white king. He can easily be caught out along this diagonal, for example. It's probably fair to say then that white shouldn't dive in then with the move f5. But black still has the plan of knight a5 and maybe to c4 either first or after bishop c4. And of course there's always the looming threat of rook takes c3. More recently it was decided that if the white knight was going to retreat to b3 anyway, then the dark square bishop is comparatively redundant on e3 and instead may well prefer to go to g5, from where it can exert pressure both on the f6 knight and through to the e7 pawn. This is in fact called the Karpov system, although Karpov doesn't play it today. There are a few permutations available to white. Instead of bishop g5, he might try king h1. Putting the king in the corner is useful for white if, say, he's intending to launch his f-pawn up the board. Also, maybe bishop g5 with king h1 and then f4. A similar logic dictates that here, because the white knight has moved from the d4 square, black can develop the bishop on e6. Also possible is a plan of a6 with b5 to follow. Unlike in the Yugoslav attack, black does not need to be so accurate as the position is not a matter of life and death. Two recent games involving world-class players illustrate the importance of the c4 square and the vulnerability of white's queenside pawns. In Yay Lebojevic, black gets in an early b5 due to a tactic on e4. If here, for example, bishop takes b5, then knight takes e4. Black has a check on b6 with the queen, which will get him out of all trouble. When Anand played Topalov at Linares in 1994, after a6, white put the brakes on the b5 push with a4, and black, after bishop e6, king h1, had to seek play elsewhere. After rook c8, f4, knight a5, white captured on a5, black recaptured with the queen, white's bishop went to d3 to support the e4 pawn, thus guarding against an exchange sacrifice on c3, and basically black won by victimising the queenside pawns, queen b4, and already the b2 pawn was in a lot of trouble. As theory stands in 1995, the quite classical variation is not a line which looks like bringing the dragon crashing down. I've never considered the move 6g3 to be particularly inspirational. Why should the white bishop want to develop itself on g2 when there's plenty of possibilities along the f1 to a6 diagonal? After g3, I think it's clear though that black should play knight to c6 in preference to bishop g7. The reason for this is, after bishop g7, bishop g2, black no longer has the chance for knight c6 because knight c6, knight takes c6, b takes c6 and e5, when both the knight on f6 and the pawn on c6 come under attack. The knight on c6 puts white's centre under immediate pressure. Definitely most testing, if you can call it testing, is the retreat of the knight to e2. Should white continue with bishop g2, frankly, black can simply exchange on d4, bringing the queen into the centre, where here it will soon be vulnerable to the bishop on g7. After knight de2, I'm going to suggest a nifty little idea which gives white a taste of his own medicine. It starts with the funny looking move bishop d7. The reason why this is given in preference to bishop to g7 will soon become clear. White plays bishop to g2, and now queen c8. The point is that the only way that white can be sure of keeping the black knight out of g4 is by playing h3. But if white plays h3 here, he will not be able to castle, because then, of course, the h-pawn can simply be snapped up by the bishop on d7. No less of a key square for white in this variation as in any other white line is the d5 square. Here in the game, Kudrin against Rachel's, Sergei Kudrin, a good dragon player himself, white played knight to d5. Black defended the knight with bishop to g7 and white castled. There's often a problem with exchanging on d5, knight takes d5, as after e takes d5, the point is that there could be some potential pressure along the e file. Nevertheless, this is the option which black took here, and here moved the knight to e5. We've seen where the knight can go to from this square. It's got the c4 square as well as the g4 square to move to. Now white expanded on the queen side, a4, the logical step to prevent black from ever playing b5. Also possible is that the white rook may wish to come out at some stage, rook up to a3 and possibly over to e3. Now, in the similar manner in which white trades off black's dragon bishop in the Yugoslav attack, black now played bishop to h3. White, not to be put off by this, played rook a2, perhaps preventing the black knight from hopping to c4. He's protecting the b2 pawn and perhaps wants to advance it. Therefore needs the rook to come off of this long diagonal. However, this clearly was not black's intention, as he now played h5. This is what I mean by own medicine. Black is now ploughing down the h file. White exchanged off on h3. The queen recaptured. Already we can see that black is not only threatening knight g4, but simply knight f3 check with a mate on h2. White prevented this with f3. One possibility for white is that after h4 he can play g4, trapping in the black queen. Instead, black played g5. His intention is clearly to play g4 and gain the f3 square for his black knight. Now, why can't this pawn be taken? Let's have a quick look. If bishop takes g5, black can continue with h4 anyway. If bishop takes h4, black can sacrifice the exchange, rook takes bishop, pawn takes rook, and now knight takes f3 check. The white king, though not getting mated just yet, is definitely in big trouble. What of the incarceration trick g4? Well, now because the bishop on g5 is vulnerable, black has, for example, knight takes g4, and on f takes g4, queen takes g4 check, picking up the loose bishop. I've included this game in the booklet for your amusement. As we can see, this rook on a2 gets us a few laughs. Anyway, black soon drums up a devastating attack. After 6g3, black has a variety of reasonable continuations. The line with bishop d7 and queen c8, followed by razzing your h-pawn down the board, can provide unsuspecting opponents with a lot of bother. This game between Kudrin and Rachel's provides a model demonstration. The bishop c4 variation of the dragon is quite common with those white players who want to be aggressive but haven't quite got the bottle for the Yugoslav attack. Perhaps they're of a slightly nervous disposition. In contrast to the Levenfish and the g3 systems, the natural bishop g7 is the most accurate response, as knight c6 falls foul of knight takes c6, b takes c6, and e5. D takes e5, not the best, though it's looking pretty grim, and now bishop takes f7 check, king's forced to recapture, but let's say goodbye to the queen on d8. After bishop g7, h3 is a common move. This prevents either the black knight on f6 or the bishop on c8 going to g4. Black castles. The bishop will come to e3 to support the knight on d4. Black knight comes to its most active square on c6. Here, black is threatening a neat trick. Knight takes e4, knight takes e4, and then d5. For this reason, the retreat bishop b3 is more accurate than white castling immediately. For me, one solitary game played in 1992 superbly highlights the principles of this variation. In the white corner we have Yoni the point collector Hector, whilst in the black is Russian dragon expert Sergei Tivyakov. Bishop d7 vacates the c8 square for the black rook. White castles, and black a6 preparing b5. White expands on the king side, f4, b5. As black is threatening b4 to distract the knight from its duties on e4, white plays a3. The rook comes to c8. Here it's on an excellent line, and of course we mustn't forget the possible exchange sacrifice on c3. White supports the e4 pawn and prepares to bring the a rook into the game with queen f3. Black sets off on a only too familiar route to c4 via a5, knight a5. Now here, it should be noted that the e5 move is now possible for white, but after e5 here, black should play knight takes b3, c takes b3, and knight e8. It is possible now, in fact likely, that white has overextended in the centre. His e5 pawn's a problem, and of course if he simply trades on d6, ed6, the black knight will come back into the game, and black will find himself comfortably better off with two excellent bishops. Instead, white played the natural rook a d1, and the black knight crashed into c4. This of course puts pressure on both the e3 bishop and the b2 pawn. White solved this with bishop c1. This looks passive, but we mustn't forget that this bishop of course can come out later on in the game. Black played queen c7, enabling possibilities of knight takes a3. Don't forget, the white knight on c3 could again be vulnerable. The cautious king h1 was white's next move, after which black crashed through in the centre with e5. Now, a few words on this move. First of all, it does temporarily obstruct the dragon's key diagonal, but it's clear that the pawn will not stay on e5 forever. Black has also conceded the d5 square. This is an outpost, but on the other hand, black is only too capable of covering it with his pieces. The d6 pawn is backward, but this also cannot be attacked easily. White retreated the knight to e2, knight d e2, and now black's light square bishop appeared on a very dangerous diagonal. Note the e4 pawn, the queen, and of course the king. White played f5, very hopefully trying to steamroller black with g4 and g5. This of course is very risky, bearing in mind this long diagonal. Yoni himself told me that here he is already in trouble. I recommend you squeeze every drop out of this classic encounter by playing through the rest of your game for yourself. Watch out for the positional exchange sack of black's rook for white's dark squared bishop. This really questions whether the traditional point count of 5 for a rook and 3 for a bishop is appropriate in the dragon. To conclude, basically the Sicilian dragon is where it's at. Unfortunately, the compulsion for white to play an open Sicilian is yet to be written into the laws of chess. Indeed, sadly it appears that more and more so-called Sicilian bashers are losing their nerve and, as a preference to dropping 1e4 completely, are turning to the so-called anti-Sicilians. In order to provide a complete Sicilian repertoire, I have made an accompanying video to cover all of these variations, especially from a dragon player's perspective. I hope that there will be exciting times ahead for you. May the Force and the Dragon be with you.